Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. I did a mythology video about a month ago around Halloween, and not too many people watched it. But the people who liked it really liked it. So I figured I'd do another one for those people, and for everybody else, I'll try and tie this in with comics as well. Because the thing is about stories, and especially the stories that we love, the comic stories, they have precursors, and those precursors are mythology. It draws back into mythology is where these stories come from. Because, well, if you write a story, you will be told, never do anything new. You're not actually supposed to do anything new. If you come to a editor or a publisher and say, hey, I had this completely new story, well, they will laugh at you and tell you to go away. Now, the reason why they do that primarily is because if you want to draw in an audience, you have to use a story that everybody is familiar enough with so that they enjoy it, so they don't have to think of it as work in order to actually understand it. So it has to be fairly familiar to them. You have to do something new with that familiar story, but you still have to have a familiar base. And that familiar base for comics and our comic stories originally ties back into mythology. And there are three great cycles of mythology that it ties back into. And that would be the classical cycle, the French cycle, and the English cycle. Now, you notice that the Norse cycle of mythology is not on this list. And that's because it's actually a fairly recent thing to be a source for stories for people. And there was a revival of the old Celtic myth and the Norse myth in the 1800s. And the old Celtic myth sort of died out again. But the reason why the Norse myth sort of endured was because of, well, let's say a certain national socialist movement in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, and their love for all things of Norse mythology. And they promoted things like Wagner and, plays and paintings of these ancient Norse myths, and those things still stick around with us today. And they sort of appealed to us, anyways, us English speakers, because we have a tie-in with Norse mythology just because of our background. I mean, we have, 4 days of the week named after Norse gods, for crying out loud. You have Tuesday, which is Tuesday, after the god of war. You have Wednesday, which is Wodan's Day for Odin. You have Thor's Day, which is Thursday, obviously. And you have Freya Day, which is Friday, which is named after the goddess of fertility. So, as English speakers, we have a lot of tie-in with Norse mythology anyways, so it kind of stuck around. And it is the basis for a lot of our stories today, but it's a fairly new basis. It's only been around for about 100 years, and there's not a whole lot to draw on. And the thing is that the reason why it sort of never got used before was because, well, adventure stories and those kinds of mythological stories that you would write off of myth, fantasy stories, they wanted to have an audience that included kids, and, well, let's just say Norse mythology is not very kid-friendly, to say the least. I did another video where I talked about heroes, and I gave one example of Thor not being a hero, not in legend. I mean, he was a Norse hero, but they were pirates, basically. He's not a hero as we would think of a hero today. And the story just briefly was about Thor and Loki going on a journey, and they had to stop somewhere to eat, and they demanded food of these peasants, this peasant family. And Loki, during the night, he actually tricked some of the people of the peasants into unknowingly breaking one of the bones of one of the goats of the flying goats of Thor. And Thor became enraged the next day and was going to kill them all. And the peasant said, no, look, we have this little boy and little girl, our children. Take them as slaves and don't kill us. And Thor said, yeah, I guess it's a good idea. I'll do that. I'll take them as slaves. I won't kill y'all. So that was the kind of hero that Thor was. Not really heroic, not as we would see it. So the hero quality of Thor that we think of today, well, that's pretty much an invention of Marvel. And there was a lot of other things in your Norse mythology, which I'll give you a little warning here. This is not the nicest story in the world, but Norse mythology is full of these kinds of stories. You had Thor tormenting his brother Loki by taking a rope and tying it to a goat, and then taking the other end of the rope and tying it to the testicles of his sleeping brother Loki, and then getting the goat to take off as quickly as possible. Now, these are the kinds of stories that just run all the way through Norse mythology, and you can see why it's not exactly kid-friendly, and it's not exactly a source that people traditionally used. So the traditional 3 cycles of mythology that people used were the classical, which was the ancient Greek and Roman, and the French and the English. Now, the ancient Greek and Roman, I would say it is the one that influences how our comics are made in the artistic sense most. And the thing is that with your ancient classical, your Greek and your Roman stories, there were some stuff that wasn't very kid-friendly here and there, but there were a lot of stories that were. And it persisted mainly because, well, up until about the 1900s, Latin was just your international language. French started to take over a little bit, but it was Latin. And how did schoolboys learn Latin? Well, they read Virgil. And Virgil's Aeneid, it's about Aeneas. He was the last basic survivor of the Trojan War, and from the Trojan side, that is. And he fled off into Italy, where he started the precursor of the Roman civilization. So that was the story of Aeneas. And all schoolboys knew that. And if they loved these kinds of stories and wanted more of these kinds of adventure stories, well, they would be given the Iliad and the Odyssey to read. And here you have pictures of heroes like Achilles, who would actually have supplanted Zeus as the king of the gods if he was Zeus's son, if that had happened. And you have, your smart aleck Odysseus and all these other kinds of heroes, and that draws back into things like Jason and the Argonauts, where you have Hercules, who, was a man originally and just became a demigod after he was killed, and all the great labors of Hercules, where he went around trying to rid the world of monsters and his battle with monsters. You can tie a lot of these heroic aspects into our stories as comic book readers, but as I said, it would be the visual. I think what visual we have of godlike superheroes comes from your ancient Greek and Rome, because there is so much of a palette, I guess we'll say, for these kinds of things in art, which are based off of ancient Greek and Roman myth. And you have these godlike figures. And there isn't a lot of Greek and Roman myth, I would say, in many comic books. In Marvel, you have Hercules, but he's always been a 3rd or even 4th tier character. He's never worked out very well. But you have Wonder Woman in DC, and although she doesn't tie in a whole lot at times with the ancient Greek and Roman myth, the thing is that I would say with Wonder Woman, the greatest run of Wonder Woman ever would be the run that George Perez worked on. And if there was anyone that was a comic artist who just embodied the Greek and Roman spirit of art, it would be George Perez. That is the kind of beauty that was in the original art that got carried all the way towards what we see on the page today. And you just see in George Perez, especially early George Perez, that really, really heavy attention to detail, and how everything was just so uniform, and everything is always the same, as in, all of the features of these characters are the same, and body proportions are always exactly right, all this kinds of stuff. And this is partly, by the way, the reason why we probably don't have a whole lot of Greek and Roman myth in what we read today. It's just because, well, when that Norse mythology moved in, a whole bunch of German thinkers tried to oust all of these Greek and Roman myths just because of their tie with the Greek and Roman mindset and philosophy, which they claimed was much, much too rational, and they wanted to get rid of that. Does that sound familiar to anybody today with what kind of things are going on? They wanted to get rid of the rational altogether and have all this dynamism where you just didn't have any basis for anything and just went from one thing to another and flittered from here to there. And it was all about creation and destruction, not about things looking reasonably proportioned. So that's a kind of tie-in with the Norse mythology. But besides the Greek and Roman, besides this backdrop of beauty which they have given us, we have two other cycles, which is the French and the English cycle. Now, the French cycle, I'll probably go over just very briefly. The French cycle is about Charlemagne and his paladins. And I would say that if you are looking for really virtuous heroes, if you are looking for your absolute paragons of virtue, because I would say any hero has to be a paragon of virtue, but if you're looking for your absolute paragons of virtue, like your Superman, you would be tracing that back to Charlemagne and his paladins. And the reason why Charlemagne and his actual myth, we'll say, because he was an actual historical character, but the stories are fanciful to some extent. The reason why it actually died out in a lot of our stories, I would say, is probably the same reason why it had stuck around for so long. It was simply because he fought the Saracens. And he and his band of paladins, well, all of their adventures are predicated on the idea that they are the heroes. They are absolutely in the right, the other side is absolutely in the wrong. People today don't tend to like that kind of a story. And the reason why it sort of faded in the early modern period was because, well, the French, because Charlemagne was French, and he lived around the 800s, and he was the progenitor of the French nation and the French kings. If there was one enemy of England, it would be France. Now, most people don't think about that today. They think about it more Germany kind of being England's arch enemy, but no, traditionally it's France. They hated France. Hundreds and hundreds of years hated France. It's only a fairly recent thing where it switched over a little bit to Germany, but the English, they hated the French, and they tried to smear the French in every way possible, and one of these unique smear campaigns was to paint their crusades in a negative light as much as possible. And they were very good at doing this in England, so much so that their histories are just starting to fade now, while people are looking to original sources and saying, hey, wait a minute, these facts that we thought were facts about the Crusades, they don't seem to be very well grounded in history. They seem to be propaganda put out by English historians to make the French look bad. And that's the kind of thing that held sway for a long time. And for the English and English speakers, kind of didn't allow us to connect with Charlemagne. But again, I would say if you're looking for your ideas of paragons of virtue, you would go back to Charlemagne. But the most influential for us as English speakers would be the English cycle. And that is, of course, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And the thing is about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, he has a connection to a lot of different kinds of myth and draws on a lot of different kinds of myth. First of all, he was a reaction to Charlemagne, because in your, we'll say, late medieval period between your 800s and your 1200s, when the French warriors would go off to war to fight against the English, what would they do? They would sing the Song of Roland. They would sing these songs of Charlemagne, and that would be their rallying cry. And so the English said, well, we got to have something of the same magnitude. And what they did was they delved into their history, and they came up with King Arthur. And that became their rallying cry. So it had a connection with the Charlemagne myth in that sense. He also had a very good connection with the ancient Roman and Greek myth, because, of course, you have King Arthur, and he is actually supposed to be tied in with your Roman myth at the very least, because King Arthur is the son of Uther Pendragon, who was the son of Constantine III, who was a pretender emperor in Great Britain. And so he was connected almost directly with the emperors of Rome. And so these kings of England were said to have tied in their kingship to the Empire of Rome, to being an emperor of Rome, even though he was really just a pretender emperor. So you have that tie-in. And also, of course, you have the older stories of your English-speaking people supposedly being taken from the grandson of Aeneas, who was a Trojan, so you have that tie-in as well. But there is also a massive tie-in with his stories to the ancient Celtic mythology, because, well, basically, you have King Arthur, who was the last of the great Celtic heroes, and many of his stories tie in with the ancient Celtic myth. You have your idea of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. That was a story that was taken almost entirely from your ancient Celtic myth. And all of these kinds of stories, some might even say the quest for the Holy Grail is connected more to your ancient Celtic cauldron myths and all these kinds of things. And the reason why I would say that King Arthur is most influential for our comic heroes is because, well, most people are familiar with the idea of the hero cycle. You have a hero, I talked about this in a couple of my videos, where he has a pathos. He goes through some pain, he goes through some tragedy, and he comes out the other end as a hero. And this is based a little bit upon your idea of not just mythology, but more your folklore and your Mother Goose tales, where you had these little kids. They would go into the woods and they would come out the other side a little wiser. And that was the reason for your fairy tales. You would teach very young children that you start off here as innocent, you make a bit of a mistake, you end up lost somewhere, and then you go through a little bit of hardship, you come out the other side a little wiser. And this influenced greatly the idea of how to tell the story of a hero. And it is ingrained in so many of our hero stories that you go through this struggle, this battle, something of that kind, in order to come out the other side as a hero. To go through this tragedy, to go through something which is going to hone you into a hero, to make you a hero. You have a purpose as a hero. And the thing is that it is tied in very much with something that people really don't think about. It's because you have these little kids in these Mother Goose tales where they go into the woods and then come out the other side a little bit wiser. And it's the going into the woods thing that I would say is what we have to thank mythology for. Because the mythology that we have, again, even if it's Charlemagne, but also for King Arthur, these are things which are fairly old historically. You have Charlemagne in the 800s. You have King Arthur, who historically was supposed to have gone off to Avalon in 542, I do believe. And the thing is that these people, they lived in a society which was just a forest. I mean, if you're looking at Great Britain, if you're looking at Ireland in those times, especially for, King Arthur in the 500s, they just lived in a forest island. It reminds me of the description of the island that I now live on when it was first discovered by Europeans. When they saw it from their ships originally, they thought that it just looked like some green heather floating on the waves. But when they got closer and closer to it, it was said that to them it looked like a giant forest just erupted from the ocean. And that's the kind of island that both Great Britain and Ireland were at that time of King Arthur. Certainly up until almost the mid-1200s, that's what it looked like. It was a giant forest punctuated by these little kingdoms, and you had a little bit of rocky area and some plains that were natural, but honestly, most of it was just forest. There are accounts even up until the 1100s where you could go from one side of England to the other without ever having to leave the forest. And this is the kind of society that they lived in. And this is why in their stories you constantly have someone going into the woods, into a different kingdom that no one had ever discovered before, and no one would ever find again, and having this adventure and then coming back out. And again, no one would ever find this place ever again. It's because of this dense, almost primordial forest that existed at that time. And This ties in, again, very much with the idea of how a hero becomes a hero in our eyes, because you go into the woods and you come out after an adventure somewhat the wiser. And this is the structure of our stories. This is the structure of so many great comic stories. These are the bones. Just like you have your ancient Greek and Roman sculptures and pictures that are the palette for our visual, for our storytelling, the basic bare bones is go into the woods, come out a little bit wiser after having an adventure. And you become a hero either to begin with, or a greater hero if you were a hero before. And there are so many other elements of characteristics and why we call a hero, and all of these things which just run through mythology again and again. But I've gone on much too long already today for this. So if you actually like this video, please hit like. Hit the shield in the lower right hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a message. Tell me whether or not you think I should do any more of these kinds of videos about mythology. Alright, I'll see you later. Bye.